The blood on Clara Bennett's hands had dried to a rusty brown by the time she stumbled upon the weathered fence post marking the edge of the Double Creek Ranch. Montana Territory, 1883, was no place for a woman alone, but Clara had run out of options the moment she'd pulled the trigger back in Helena. She collapsed against the post, her legs finally giving out after miles of desperate flight. The tears came unbidden, silent sobs racking her slender frame as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. The life she'd known was over. There was no going back. "Mighty strange place for a lady to be taking a rest," a deep voice drawled, startling Clara from her misery. Her head snapped up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. A man astride a chestnut mare, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows across his face. A rifle rested casually across his lap. Clara's voice caught in her throat as she hastily wiped at her tears. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. As he approached, his features came into focus. A square jaw darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a mouth set in a hard line. "You're on Double Creek land, madam," he said, his tone softer now that he could see her clearly. "And you look like you've seen better days." Clara tried to stand, but her exhausted legs betrayed her. The man moved forward with surprising grace for his size and caught her before she could fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed by her weakness. "I didn't know this was private property. I'll move along." The man studied her face, taking in the tear tracks cutting through the dust on her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes, and the dried blood on her hands. "I'll give you a home if you give me a reason to smile," said the cowboy to the crying woman. "Haven't had much cause for that lately." Clara stared at him, disbelief evident in her reddened eyes. "You don't know me." "Name's Matthew Holden," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Owner of this here ranch." "And you are?" "Clara," she answered hesitantly. "Clara Bennett." Matthew nodded, as if her name confirmed something for him. "Well, Miss Bennett, you look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest. Double Creek can provide both, at least for tonight." Clara glanced nervously over her shoulder, half expecting to see riders on the horizon. "Why would you help a stranger?" Matthew's weathered face softened momentarily. "Out here, refusing aid is as good as signing someone's death warrant. I may not be the most sociable man in the territory, but I'm not in the business of leaving women to die on my property." He paused, studying her again. "Whatever trouble you're in, it can wait until morning." Against her better judgment, Clara nodded. She had nowhere else to go, and the thought of food and shelter was too tempting to refuse. Matthew helped her onto his horse with careful hands, then mounted behind her. Clara stiffened at the proximity, but exhaustion soon had her leaning back against his solid chest as they rode toward the distant buildings of Double Creek Ranch. "Don't worry," Matthew said quietly, his breath warm against her hair. "You're safe now." Clara didn't believe him couldn't afford to, but for the moment, she allowed herself to pretend it might be true. The main house of Double Creek Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. It was larger than Clara had expected, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, including a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a cookhouse. "It's not much," Matthew said, misinterpreting her surprised expression, "but it keeps the rain out and the warmth in." "It's beautiful," Clara replied honestly. After weeks in cramped stagecoaches and dirty hotel rooms, the ranch house looked like a palace. As they approached, a wiry man with silver-streaked hair emerged from the barn, eyebrows rising at the sight of Clara. "Rufus," Matthew called out. "Tell Mrs. Abernathy we'll have a guest for dinner." The man named Rufus touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his curious gaze lingering on Clara before he headed toward the cookhouse. Matthew dismounted first, then reached up to help Clara down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, and she swayed dangerously. Without comment, Matthew swept her into his arms and carried her toward the house. "This isn't necessary," Clara protested weakly. "Probably not," he agreed with the ghost of a smile. "But it's faster than watching you fall on your face." Inside, the ranch house was surprisingly refined. Polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and even a few framed landscapes adorning the walls spoke of care and permanence. Matthew deposited Clara gently onto a sofa in what appeared to be a sitting room. "Mrs. Abernathy will bring some food shortly," he said, moving to a cabinet and extracting a bottle and 2 glasses. "In the meantime, this might help." He poured a finger of amber liquid into each glass and handed one to Clara. She accepted it cautiously, then took a tentative sip. The whiskey burned a path down her throat, but the warmth that followed was welcome. "Now," Matthew said, settling into a chair across from her, "I won't ask what put that look in your eyes or whose blood is on your hands. That's your business." He took a drink from his own glass. "But I should know if I need to post extra guards tonight." Clara's fingers tightened around her glass. "I don't think anyone followed me, but they will be looking." Matthew nodded, unsurprised. "The law." "Eventually," she admitted. "But there are others who'll come first." Before Matthew could respond, the door opened to admit a stout woman with gray-streaked brown hair tucked into a severe bun. She carried a tray laden with food, her sharp eyes immediately finding Clara. "Mrs. Abernathy," Matthew said, rising, "this is Miss Bennett. She'll be staying with us for a while." "I can see that," the housekeeper replied dryly. She set the tray on a small table beside Clara. "Eat, child. You look half-starved." The savory aroma of beef stew made Clara's mouth water. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until food was placed before her. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Mrs. Abernathy nodded briskly. "I've prepared the guest room upstairs and drawn a bath, which you look in desperate need of." She turned to Matthew. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Holden?" "That's all, thank you." Once the housekeeper had departed, Clara looked up from her stew to find Matthew watching her with an unreadable expression. "Your housekeeper doesn't seem surprised by strange women arriving at your doorstep," she observed, trying to gauge what kind of man had taken her in. A shadow crossed Matthew's face. "Mrs. Abernathy has been with Double Creek since my father's time. She's seen this ranch through its best and worst days." Clara sensed there was more to the story, but Matthew offered nothing further. Instead, he stood and moved toward the door. "Finish your meal and get cleaned up. We can talk more tomorrow when you've rested." He paused, looking back at her. "Whatever you're running from, Miss Bennett, it won't find you tonight." After he left, Clara ate quickly, surprised by her own appetite. The stew was hearty and flavorful, the best meal she'd had in weeks. When she finished, she followed Mrs. Abernathy's directions to the upstairs guest room. The bath waiting for her was still steaming, and Clara nearly wept at the sight of it. She peeled off her filthy traveling dress, wincing at the dried blood that flaked away from her skin. As she sank into the warm water, images from the previous night flashed through her mind: the struggle, the gun, the shocked expression on Harold Blackwood's face as he fell. Clara scrubbed until her skin was raw, but the feeling of his hands on her wouldn't wash away so easily. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her, and she donned the simple cotton nightgown Mrs. Abernathy had left for her. The bed was soft, the sheets clean, and despite her fear and uncertainty, Clara fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came with the sound of a rooster's call and the scent of coffee and bacon drifting up from below. Clara woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The previous day rushed back in a flood of memories, and she sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. On a chair near the bed, she found a simple dress laid out for her, clearly not new, but clean and well-mended. Clara dressed quickly, grateful for the fresh clothing, and made her way downstairs. She found Matthew in the kitchen, seated at a large wooden table with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. He looked up as she entered, and Clara was struck again by the intensity of his gaze. "Good morning," he said, folding his paper. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for the clothes." Matthew nodded toward the stove where Mrs. Abernathy was cooking. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Clara accepted a cup from the housekeeper and settled at the table across from Matthew. For a moment, they sat in surprisingly comfortable silence. "I need to know," Matthew finally said, "if you're planning to move on today." Clara stared into her coffee. The truth was, she had nowhere to go. Her family was back east, and she couldn't risk leading trouble to their doorstep. The money she'd saved working as a schoolteacher in Helena wouldn't last long on the run. "I shouldn't impose on your hospitality any further," she said quietly. Matthew studied her, his expression thoughtful. Double Creek could use another pair of hands. Mrs. Abernathy isn't getting any younger, and the ranch house has been neglected since. He trailed off, then continued more firmly. There's work here if you want it. Room and board, plus a small wage. Clara looked up in surprise. You're offering me a job? You don't even know me. I know you're running from something bad enough to put that look in your eyes, he replied evenly. I know you're educated by the way you speak. And I know an extra set of hands around here would make Mrs. Abernathy stop complaining about her rheumatism. From the stove, the housekeeper harumphed but didn't contradict him. Why would you take such a risk? Clara pressed. I could be anyone. Matthew's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. You promised me a reason to smile, remember? Consider this your chance to make good on that. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks as she recalled his words from the previous day. I don't believe I actually agreed to that arrangement. No, he conceded, but the offer stands nonetheless. Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Rufus entered, his expression urgent. Riders coming, he announced. For men, moving fast. Look like they mean business. Matthew was on his feet instantly, all traces of amusement gone. He looked at Clara, whose face had drained of color. Friends of yours? She shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. Blackwood's men. Mrs. Abernathy, take Miss Bennett upstairs, Matthew ordered, moving to a cabinet where he retrieved a shotgun. Rufus, get the boys ready. As the housekeeper hurried her toward the stairs, Clara grabbed Matthew's arm. Please, don't get involved. These men are dangerous. Blackwood was powerful. Matthew asked sharply. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. He tried to. I had no choice. Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. He nodded once. Go upstairs. Stay quiet. This is my land, and I decide who's welcome here. Clara allowed Mrs. Abernathy to lead her upstairs, but instead of hiding in her room, she went to a window overlooking the front yard. From there, she could see 4 riders approaching, dust billowing behind their horses. Her stomach clenched in recognition. Blackwood's foreman, Wade Turner, led the group. Below, Matthew stood on the porch, shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. Several ranch hands had emerged from the bunkhouse, strategically positioned around the yard, all armed. The riders pulled up short of the house, clearly taking stock of the reception committee. Wade Turner raised a hand in greeting that contained no warmth. Morning, he called out. You Matthew Holden? I am, Matthew replied, his stance relaxed but alert. This is private property, gentlemen. Turner nodded, as if acknowledging the point. We're looking for a woman. Dark hair, blue eyes, about 25 years old. Name's Clara Bennett. Schoolteacher from Helena. What's your business with this woman? Matthew asked, giving nothing away. She's wanted for murder, Turner stated flatly. Killed Harold Blackwood 2 nights ago. Shot him in cold blood and ran. Clara's hands tightened on the windowsill. It hadn't been cold blood, it had been terror and desperation when Blackwood had cornered her after the school social, his unwanted advances turning violent when she refused him. That's so, Matthew replied, sounding unimpressed. You lawman now? Turner shifted in his saddle. We work for the Blackwood family. They want justice for Harold before the territorial marshals get involved. Family matter, you understand. Sounds like vigilante justice to me, Matthew observed coldly. And we don't hold with that at Double Creek. Listen, Holden, Turner said, his friendly facade slipping. We know she came this way. Trail leads right to your property. Just hand her over, and we'll be on our way. No need for trouble. Matthew took a step forward, and even from a distance, Clara could see the dangerous set of his shoulders. Let me be clear. I haven't seen your schoolteacher. But if I had, I certainly wouldn't turn any woman over to 4 men looking to dispense their own brand of justice without a marshal present. Turner's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Holden. The Blackwoods have influence all over this territory. And this is Double Creek land, Matthew replied evenly. My father built this ranch, and I've defended it against worse than hired thugs. So I suggest you turn around and take your grievances to the proper authorities. For a tense moment, Clara thought violence would erupt in the yard below. Turner's hand hovered near his holster, and the other men spread out slightly. But a quick survey of the armed ranch hands must have convinced Turner that the odds weren't in his favor. This isn't over, he warned, reining his horse around. That woman's a murderer, and harboring her makes you an accessory. Safe travels, Matthew replied sardonically, not moving from his position until the riders had disappeared in a cloud of dust. Clara sank to the floor beneath the window, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been standing quietly in the hallway, came to sit beside her. Mr. Holden doesn't make threats lightly, the older woman said matter-of-factly. Those men won't be back without the law, and even then, they'll find themselves unwelcome. Why would he risk so much for a stranger? Clara asked, genuinely bewildered. Mrs. Abernathy's face softened slightly. Matthew Holden is many things stubborn, too serious for his own good, and about as communicative as a fence post most days. But he's a good man who recognizes trouble when he sees it. And something tells me he saw more than trouble in you. Before Clara could question this cryptic statement, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Matthew appeared in the hallway, his expression grim but composed. They're gone for now, he said, leaning his shotgun against the wall. But they'll be back, likely with some semblance of legal authority next time. Clara stood shakily. I should leave. I've already put you all in danger. Running won't solve your problems, Miss Bennett, Matthew stated. Those men will find you eventually if you keep moving. Here, at least, you have protection. What? Clara demanded, her fear giving way to frustration. Why would you stand against 4 armed men for someone you just met? Something flashed in Matthew's eyes, anger, perhaps, or determination. Because I know what men like Harold Blackwood are capable of. And I know what it means when a woman is desperate enough to use a gun against one. Clara felt exposed, as if he could see every detail of that terrible night. You can't know what happened. I don't need to know the specifics, he replied quietly. I've seen enough of this world to recognize when someone's been wronged. The question now is whether you'll stay and fight, or keep running until they catch you. Put so bluntly, Clara's options seemed stark. If I stay, I'll need to face a judge eventually. Matthew nodded. Yes, but with witnesses speaking to Blackwood's character and a proper lawyer, you might stand a chance. Running guarantees only one outcome. Clara took a deep breath, considering his words. If I accept your offer the job, what exactly would it entail? A hint of satisfaction crossed Matthew's face. Helping Mrs. Abernathy with the house, keeping the accounts in order. I saw your hands yesterday. They're a teacher's hands, not a laborer's. I figure you can read and cipher better than most around here. I can, Clara acknowledged. I taught children ranging from 6 to 16 in Helena. Then it's settled, Matthew said with a note of finality. You'll stay at Double Creek, at least until we figure out how to address your legal situation properly. Clara wanted to argue further, to explain that she couldn't possibly accept such an arrangement from a stranger, but the events of the morning had left her drained. Instead, she simply nodded. Thank you, she said softly. I'll earn my keep, I promise. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. I'm still waiting for that reason to smile, Miss Bennett. Perhaps you'll come up with it while balancing my ledgers. With that, he turned and headed back downstairs, leaving Clara to wonder exactly what she'd gotten herself into. The next few days established a rhythm that Clara found surprisingly comforting after weeks of uncertainty. She rose early, helped Mrs. Abernathy with breakfast, and then spent mornings organizing Matthew's chaotic account books in a small study off the main sitting room. The afternoons were devoted to various household tasks, mending, cleaning, or helping the housekeeper prepare meals for the ranch hands. Matthew himself was often absent during daylight hours, riding out with his men to tend to cattle, repair fencing, or handle the myriad tasks required to keep a large ranch functioning. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain distance that Clara found both frustrating and intriguing. On her 4th day at Double Creek, Clara was elbow-deep in flour, learning to make Mrs. Abernathy's famous biscuits, when the housekeeper abruptly changed the subject from cooking to her employer. He wasn't always so closed off, you know, the older woman remarked, expertly cutting butter into her own batch of dough. Matthew used to laugh readily enough before the troubles came. Clara looked up, curious despite herself. What troubles? Mrs. Abernathy's hands never stopped working as she spoke. 4 years ago, this ranch was twice the size it is now. Matthew's father, James Holden, built it from nothing into one of the most prosperous spreads in the territory. Then came the winter of '79, worst anyone had ever seen. She paused, shaping her dough with practiced movements. The cattle died by the hundreds, frozen where they stood, some of them. By spring, Double Creek was on the verge of ruin. James took ill during the worst of it, pneumonia. Never recovered. That's terrible, Clara said softly, thinking of her own father back in Pennsylvania, his letters always filled with concern for his Wild West daughter. It gets worse, Mrs. Abernathy continued. Matthew was engaged then to Eliza Winters, banker's daughter from over in Bozeman. Pretty thing, but no backbone to speak of. When she saw how the ranch was struggling, she broke it off. Married a railroad man 3 months later. Clara frowned, trying to reconcile this story with the stern, capable rancher she was coming to know. So he lost his father and his fiancée in the same year? And nearly lost the ranch too, Mrs. Abernathy confirmed, sliding her biscuits into the oven. Had to sell off the north pastures to pay the debts. Worked himself half to death rebuilding what remained. She fixed Clara with a meaningful look. That's why he doesn't smile much anymore. Too busy making sure history doesn't repeat itself. Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Rufus entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Bennett, he greeted them. Marshall's just arrived from Helena. Wants to speak with Mr. Holden. Clara's hands froze in the dough, her heart suddenly pounding. Is Mr. Holden here? He's on his way in from the east pasture, Rufus replied, his weathered face sympathetic. Marshall's waiting in the sitting room. Asked about you directly, miss. Mrs. Abernathy wiped her hands decisively on her apron. Well then, I'll bring some coffee while we wait for Mr. Holden. Clara, you'd best clean up and compose yourself. Clara nodded mutely, terror and resignation warring within her. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but the brief respite at Double Creek had allowed her to pretend otherwise. By the time she entered the sitting room, her hands were clean but trembling slightly. The marshal, a tall, lean man with a neatly trimmed mustache and observant eyes, stood as she entered. Matthew had not yet arrived. Miss Bennett, the lawman said, touching the brim of his hat. I'm Marshal Daniel Hayes from the Helena office. I'd like to ask you some questions about the night of May 12th. Clara's throat felt dry as she took a seat across from him. Yes, sir. I understand there was an altercation between you and Harold Blackwood that ended in his death. Hayes continued, his tone professional but not unkind. I'd like to hear your account of what happened. Taking a deep breath, Clara forced herself to meet his gaze. Mr. Blackwood had been persistent in his attentions for several months. I declined his proposals repeatedly, but he wouldn't accept my refusals. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. After the school social that night, he followed me home, forced his way into my rooms above the mercantile. He said no one refused a Blackwood, and he intended to teach me my place. The marshal nodded, making notes in a small book. And then, he attacked me, Clara said, her voice dropping. Tore my dress. I fought back, but he was so strong. There was a pistol in my desk drawer. My father insisted I keep one for protection when I moved west. I managed to reach it, and when he came at me again, I fired. Hayes wrote for a moment more before looking up. Miss Bennett, the Blackwood family has considerable influence in Helena. They're claiming you shot Harold in cold blood when he attempted to end your relationship. Clara stiffened. That's a lie. There was no relationship to end. That may be, Hayes acknowledged, but without witnesses, it's your word against the Blackwood family's considerable influence. The door opened then, and Matthew strode in, still dusty from his day's work. His eyes found Clara first, assessing her with a quick glance before turning to the marshal. Hayes, he greeted the lawman with a nod. I see you've met Miss Bennett. Holden, the marshal returned evenly. I was just explaining to Miss Bennett the seriousness of her situation. Matthew moved to stand near Clara's chair, his presence oddly reassuring. And I trust you're investigating all aspects of this case, not just the version preferred by the Blackwood family? A flicker of irritation crossed Hayes's face. I do my job thoroughly, Holden. That's why I'm here instead of simply arresting Miss Bennett on the spot. Then you'll want to speak with Abigail Cooper, Matthew said, surprising both Clara and the marshal. She works at the general store beneath Miss Bennett's rooms in Helena. I sent a telegram to her yesterday. Clara looked up at him in astonishment. How did you know about Mrs. Cooper? You mentioned living above the mercantile, Matthew replied, his eyes never leaving the marshal. It was a reasonable assumption that someone there might have information. Hayes's interest was clearly piqued. What information would Mrs. Cooper have? According to her reply, Matthew said, extracting a folded paper from his pocket, she heard Blackwood threatening Miss Bennett on multiple occasions. And on the night in question, she heard the struggle and his specific threats before the shot was fired. She was too frightened to come forward initially, given the Blackwood family's reputation. Clara felt lightheaded with relief. Mrs. Cooper, the kind widow who ran the mercantile with her son, had indeed been present that night, though Clara hadn't known if she'd heard anything through the floor. Hayes accepted the telegram, reading it with a furrowed brow. This helps your case, Miss Bennett, but it doesn't eliminate the need for a proper trial. The Blackwoods will demand it. When? Clara asked, her voice steadier than she expected. The circuit judge won't be through Helena for another 6 weeks, Hayes replied. Until then, I should technically take you into custody. Matthew's stance shifted subtly, and Clara sensed rather than saw the tension in him. That seems unnecessary, Marshal. Miss Bennett has made no attempt to flee the territory. She's employed here at Double Creek and under my personal guarantee. Hayes studied Matthew for a long moment. You're vouching for her, Holden? Putting your reputation on the line. I am, Matthew said without hesitation. The Marshal sighed, closing his notebook. Very well. Miss Bennett can remain here until the trial, but she's not to leave the immediate area. I'll expect you both in Helena when Judge Harmon arrives. He stood, replacing his hat. And Holden? The Blackwoods won't take this lying down. Watch your back. After showing the Marshal out, Matthew returned to find Clara still seated, her expression caught between gratitude and confusion. Why didn't you tell me you'd contacted Mrs. Cooper? She asked. Matthew shrugged, pouring himself a measure of whiskey from the sideboard. Wasn't certain she'd respond. No point raising hopes unnecessarily. And if she hadn't replied, then we'd have found another approach, he said simply, as if the matter were that straightforward. The truth has a way of making itself known, given enough time and effort. Clara studied him. This enigmatic man who'd taken such risks for her with so little apparent hesitation. You're a puzzling man, Matthew Holden. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. So Mrs. Abernathy frequently informs me. He took a seat across from her, his expression growing more serious. The Marshal's right about one thing: the Blackwoods won't let this go easily. They'll try to pressure the judge, maybe intimidate witnesses. What can we do? Clara asked, the brief moment of relief fading. Prepare, Matthew replied. Gather more evidence of Blackwood's character and behavior. And make sure you're never alone between now and the trial. He hesitated, then added more gently. You survived the worst night of your life, Clara. You can survive the aftermath too. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. Matthew held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away, clearing his throat. You should finish helping Mrs. Abernathy with dinner. I need to check on the new calves before dark. As he rose to leave, Clara called after him. Matthew? He paused, looking back. I promise I'll find a way to make you smile properly, she said, surprising herself with her boldness. A real smile, not just those half attempts you've been making. For a moment, Matthew looked genuinely startled. Then his expression softened into something that, while not quite a smile, contained a warmth she hadn't seen before. I'll hold you to that, Clara Bennett, he said quietly, and then he was gone, leaving her with the curious sensation that something fundamental had shifted between them. The weeks that followed brought a gradual thawing in Matthew's reserved demeanor. Clara found him joining her and Mrs. Abernathy for meals more regularly, occasionally offering comments or observations about the ranch's operations. He began to linger in the study while she worked on the accounts, first on the pretense of explaining various expenses, but eventually just sitting in the comfortable chair by the window, sometimes reading, sometimes watching her work. For her part, Clara found herself increasingly drawn to the taciturn rancher. His quiet strength was unlike anything she'd encountered in the men she'd known back east or in Helena. There was nothing showy about Matthew Holden. He simply did what needed doing. Whether that meant rising before dawn to help a cow in difficult labor or standing between her and danger without hesitation. One evening in early June, Clara was sitting on the front porch, enjoying the cooler air after a sweltering day, when Matthew joined her. He carried 2 glasses of lemonade, offering one to her without comment before taking the seat beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky transition from blue to fiery orange as the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Beautiful," Clara murmured, sipping her lemonade. "It is," Matthew agreed, though when she glanced at him, he was looking at her rather than the sunset. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away quickly. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned there's to be a social at the church in town this Saturday." Matthew nodded. "There usually is, first Saturday of each month. Never been much for socials myself. We had them regularly in Helena," Clara said, a wistful note entering her voice. "I enjoyed the music, even if the company could be challenging at times." Matthew's expression darkened slightly. "Blackwood attended these socials." "Yes," Clara admitted. "It was how we met initially. He seemed charming at first. Most predators do, I suppose." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Would you like to attend?" "The social, I mean." Clara looked at him in surprise. "Would that be wise, given everything?" "The marshal didn't confine you to the ranch, just the area," Matthew pointed out. "And it might do you good to meet some of the local families. Let them see you're not the cold-blooded murderess the Blackwoods are likely painting you as." Clara considered this logic. "And you'd accompany me?" Despite not being much for socials. The corner of Matthew's mouth twitched. "I said I'd guarantee your behavior to the marshal. Hard to do that if I'm not present." "How gallant," Clara replied dryly, but she found herself smiling. "Very well, Mr. Holden. I accept your reluctant invitation." "Good," he said, standing and collecting her empty glass. "Mrs. Abernathy will be pleased. She's been trying to drag me to these things for years." As he turned to go inside, Clara called after him, "Matthew?" He paused, looking back questioningly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for making me feel normal again, even if just for an evening." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his perpetually tense shoulders. "You're welcome, Clara." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the church social. Clara spent more time than usual preparing, washing her hair and pinning it in a style Mrs. Abernathy assured her was both fashionable and appropriate. The housekeeper had also altered one of her own dresses for Clara, a pretty blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. When she descended the stairs, Matthew was waiting in the foyer, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his usually unruly hair. The effect was striking, transforming him from rugged rancher to something approaching a gentleman. He stared at her for a long moment before clearing his throat. "You look lovely, Clara." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "You clean up rather well yourself." Mrs. Abernathy appeared from the kitchen, nodding approvingly at the pair of them. "About time this house saw some proper socializing. Now off with you both, and mind you bring back all the gossip, Miss Bennett. An old woman needs her entertainment." The church in question was located in the small town of Pine Ridge, about 5 miles from Double Creek Ranch. Matthew had the buggy brought around, helping Clara up with careful hands before taking the reins. As they drove, Clara found herself growing increasingly nervous. What if someone recognizes my name? The Blackwood situation must be common knowledge by now. "Most folks around here aren't overly fond of the Blackwoods," Matthew replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "Harold's father tried to buy up half the valley 10 years back, threatening smaller ranchers and farmers. Didn't make many friends. Still, a murderer at their church social hardly seems appropriate," Clara fretted. Matthew's hands tightened on the reins. "You're not a murderer, Clara. You defended yourself against a man who would have done worse than kill you." He glanced at her, his expression fierce. "Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise." The vehemence in his voice startled her. "You seem very certain of that, considering you weren't there." "I've seen enough of men like Blackwood to know their kind," Matthew said grimly. "And I've known you long enough now to be certain you wouldn't take a life without cause." His unwavering faith in her character left Clara momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, they crested a small hill, and the church came into view, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple, surrounded by buggies and horses. "Remember," Matthew said as he helped her down from the buggy, "you have nothing to be ashamed of. Hold your head high." Clara took a deep breath and nodded, straightening her shoulders. With Matthew beside her, she entered the churchyard where dozens of people were gathered, some dancing to fiddle music, others clustered around tables laden with food. Their arrival drew curious glances, and Clara realized belatedly that Matthew's presence was likely as much a source of interest as her own. Several people approached to greet them, their manner friendly, if inquisitive. "Matthew Holden," exclaimed a portly man with friendly eyes, pumping Matthew's hand enthusiastically. "Can't remember the last time we saw you at a social. Must be 2 years at least." "Pastor Miller." Matthew returned the greeting with more warmth than Clara had expected. "May I introduce Miss Clara Bennett? She's been helping with the accounts at Double Creek." The pastor turned his beaming smile on Clara. "Miss Bennett, a pleasure indeed. We're always delighted to welcome newcomers to our community." As more introductions were made, Clara found herself gradually relaxing. The people of Pine Ridge seemed genuinely welcoming, and if any had heard rumors about her situation, they gave no indication. The evening progressed pleasantly. Clara sampled the potluck offerings, chatted with the local women, and watched the dancing with enjoyment. Matthew remained close by, not hovering exactly, but a reassuring presence nonetheless. She noticed that while he spoke easily enough with the men about cattle prices and weather conditions, he declined all invitations to join the dancing. "Not one for dancing, Mr. Holden?" she teased when they had a moment alone. Matthew grimaced slightly. "Not a skill I ever mastered, I'm afraid." "It's not difficult," Clara assured him. "I could teach you." Before he could respond, a commotion near the church entrance drew their attention. For men had arrived, their fancy clothes and loud voices immediately setting them apart from the humble gathering. Clara's blood ran cold as she recognized Wade Turner among them. Matthew's hand came to rest protectively at the small of her back. "Blackwood's men," he murmured. "Stay calm." Turner's gaze swept the gathering until it landed on Clara and Matthew. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face as he murmured something to his companions. They began making their way through the crowd toward them. "Perhaps we should leave," Clara whispered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "Running would only confirm their version of events in everyone's minds," Matthew replied quietly. "Stand your ground, Clara." Turner stopped a few feet away, his posture deliberately casual but threatening nonetheless. Well, if it isn't the schoolteacher and her protector. Fancy meeting you here." "Turner," Matthew acknowledged coldly. "This is a church gathering. I suggest you show appropriate respect." "Oh, I always respect the church," Turner replied with mock sincerity. "Just surprised to see a murderer welcomed among the God-fearing folk of Pine Ridge." A murmur went through the crowd as people turned to watch the confrontation. Clara felt dozens of eyes on her, judging, questioning. The only crime Miss Bennett committed was defending herself against a man who should have known better, Matthew stated clearly, his voice carrying to the onlookers. "Something the courts will confirm when the time comes." Turner sneered. "Courts can be persuaded, Holden, especially when a family like the Blackwoods is seeking justice. Is that what you call it?" Clara found herself speaking, anger overcoming her fear. "Justice? Harold Blackwood tried to force himself on me. When I refused him, he attacked me. I defended myself, as any woman would." Her clear, steady voice carried across the suddenly silent gathering. Turner's expression darkened. "You're a lying whore," he spat. "Harold told us all about your arrangement. You got greedy, wanted more than he was willing to give, and shot him when he ended things." Before Clara could respond, Matthew stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "Apologize to the lady, Turner." "Now," Turner laughed. "Or what, Holden? You'll shoot me too? Like attracts like, I suppose." The tension in the air was palpable. Clara could see Matthew's hand inching toward the pistol at his hip, while Turner's men spread out slightly, ready for trouble. "That's quite enough," came a firm voice, and Pastor Miller stepped between the two groups, his expression stern. "This is God's house, and I'll not have it desecrated with violence or vile language." He turned to Turner. "You and your friends can take your grievances elsewhere, sir. Miss Bennett is a guest of our community." Turner looked as if he might argue, but a quick survey of the crowd showed that sympathy had shifted decidedly against him. Many of the local men had moved closer, their stance making it clear they stood with the pastor. "This isn't over," Turner warned, his gaze fixed on Clara. "The Blackwoods don't forget, and they don't forgive." As Turner and his companions departed, Clara found herself trembling with reaction. Matthew's arm came around her shoulders, steady and warm. "I think perhaps we should head back to Double Creek," he said quietly. Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice. As Matthew led her toward their buggy, several people approached to express their support, their earlier reserve replaced with open sympathy. "Don't you worry about those Blackwood ruffians, Miss Bennett," declared an elderly woman, patting Clara's hand. "We know they're kind around here. If you need anything at all, you come see us," added another woman. "Any friend of Matthew's is welcome in our homes." By the time they were underway, Clara's shock had given way to a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude, fear, and an odd sense of liberation. The secret that had been weighing on her was now in the open, at least in this community, and the reaction had been far more supportive than she'd dared hope. "I'm sorry," Matthew said after they'd traveled in silence for a while. "I shouldn't have insisted we attend. I didn't expect Turner to show up." "It's not your fault," Clara replied, finding her voice at last. "And perhaps it's better this way. At least now I know I'm not alone in facing them." Matthew glanced at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. "You were never alone in this, Clara. Not from the moment you collapsed against my fence post." The simple truth in his words brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her for weeks finally escaping. "Why did you help me? Why are you still helping me?" Matthew was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "4 years ago, I lost nearly everything that mattered to me. My father, the woman I thought I would marry, half the ranch my family had built." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I learned then who stood by me when things were at their worst, and who abandoned ship at the first sign of trouble." He turned to look at her, his gaze piercing even in the dim light. "When I found you that day, I saw someone who needed the kind of help no one offered me. Someone who deserved better than to be hounded and destroyed by people like the Blackwoods." Clara's heart ached at the pain evident beneath his measured words. "I'm sorry about your father. And Eliza." Matthew's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mrs. Abernathy has been talking, I see. She cares about you," Clara said simply. "As do I." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Matthew's hands tightened on the reins, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching riders reached them. "Get down," Matthew ordered sharply, pulling the buggy to a halt and reaching for his pistol. Clara ducked low as 4 riders emerged from the trees ahead, blocking the narrow road. Even in the moonlight, she could recognize Turner's distinctive silhouette. "Evening, lovebirds," Turner called out mockingly. "Thought we might continue our conversation without the church folk interfering." Matthew's voice was dangerously calm. "Move aside, Turner. You've said your piece." "Not quite," Turner replied. "See, the Blackwood family is offering a substantial reward for the return of their son's killer, dead or alive, though they'd prefer alive to face proper justice. There are witnesses to Blackwood's behavior," Matthew stated. "The marshal knows the truth. Taking Miss Bennett now would be kidnapping, not justice." Turner laughed. "Witnesses can be persuaded to reconsider their statements. Marshals can be bought. But none of that will matter if there's an unfortunate accident on this lonely road." Clara felt cold terror wash over her as the riders spread out. Matthew moved the buggy to the side of the road, positioning himself between her and the threat. "Last chance to walk away, Turner," Matthew warned. "Whatever the Blackwoods are paying you, it's not worth dying for." "Big talk from a man outnumbered 4-1. Turner sneered, drawing his pistol. What happened next occurred with startling speed. As Turner raised his weapon, Matthew fired first, the report deafeningly loud in the quiet night. Turner cried out, his pistol dropping as he clutched his shoulder. The other men immediately drew their own weapons, but before they could fire, shots rang out from the trees behind them. 2 riders appeared from the darkness, Rufus and another Double Creek hand, both armed and firing at Turner's men. In the confusion, one of Turner's companions was hit, falling from his horse with a pained shout. The others, realizing they'd ridden into an ambush, turned and fled, dragging their wounded leader with them. "Are you hurt?" Matthew demanded, turning to Clara, his face taut with concern. "No," she assured him, though her voice shook. "How did Rufus know?" "I asked him to follow at a distance," Matthew explained, relief evident in his tone. "After Turner showed up at the social, I wasn't taking any chances." Rufus rode up to the buggy, his rifle still at the ready. "They're running scared, boss. Doubt they'll try again tonight. But we should get Miss Bennett back to the ranch." Matthew nodded grimly. "Ride ahead and warn the others. I want the ranch on alert until further notice." As they continued toward Double Creek, now with Rufus's companion riding guard behind them, Clara found herself trembling with delayed shock. Without thinking, she moved closer to Matthew on the buggy seat, seeking his warmth and solidity. "I never meant to bring such danger to your door," she whispered. Matthew's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "The danger was always there, Clara. Men like Turner and the Blackwoods create it wherever they go. All you did was refuse to be their victim." When they reached the ranch, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting anxiously on the porch. One look at their faces told her something had happened. "Lord above," she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "I knew that social was a bad idea." While Matthew conferred with his men, setting up guard rotations for the night, Mrs. Abernathy led Clara upstairs, fussing over her like a mother hen. "You need rest, child," the housekeeper insisted, helping Clara out of her dress. "Whatever happened can be dealt with in the morning." But sleep proved elusive. Every time Clara closed her eyes, she saw Turner's malevolent smile, heard the crack of gunfire, felt the sick dread of knowing she'd brought this danger to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. After an hour of restless tossing, she rose and pulled on a dressing gown. Perhaps some warm milk would help settle her nerves. The house was quiet as she made her way downstairs, but a light still burned in the study. Clara hesitated, then moved toward it, drawn by the hope of company to distract her from her troubled thoughts. She found Matthew at his desk, a glass of whiskey at his elbow, studying what appeared to be a map of the ranch. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, setting aside his work. Clara shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back on that road with Turner and his men." Matthew nodded in understanding. "First gunfight is always the hardest to shake off." "Does it get easier?" she asked, moving further into the room. "Not easier," he corrected. "Just more familiar. The fear never really goes away, nor should it. Fear keeps you cautious, keeps you alive." Clara settled into the chair across from him, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if Rufus hadn't been there. If you'd been hurt because of me." Matthew studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what I thought when I first found you by my fence post?" Clara shook her head. "I thought you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen," he said quietly. "Covered in dust and blood, clearly terrified, but still standing, still fighting." He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Don't start doubting that strength now, Clara. Not when you'll need it most in the coming weeks." His faith in her brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. "I'm not sure I deserve such confidence." "You do," Matthew said simply. He hesitated, then added, "When I lost everything 4 years ago, I thought the only way forward was to shut everything out to focus solely on rebuilding the ranch, to never risk caring about anything or anyone that could be taken away again." He stood, moving to the window where moonlight streamed through the glass. "It was a lonely existence, but a safe one. Until you arrived and reminded me that safety isn't the same as living." Clara rose as well, drawn to him by the raw honesty in his voice. "Matthew." He turned to face her, the moonlight casting half his face in shadow. "I promised you a home if you gave me a reason to smile. What I didn't expect was that you'd give me a reason to feel again everything, not just happiness." The air between them seemed charged with something Clara couldn't name, but recognized instinctively. She took a step closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "And is that a fair trade, in your estimation?" she asked softly. Matthew's hand rose to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light. "More than fair," he murmured, "though I'm beginning to think I got the better end of the bargain." Clara wasn't sure who moved first, only that suddenly the space between them vanished. Matthew's lips found hers with gentle hesitation that quickly gave way to something deeper and more urgent. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, as Clara's hands slid up to his shoulders, anchoring herself against the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing raggedly, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he whispered, though he made no move to release her. "Why not?" Clara asked, her hands still clinging to his shoulders. "Because you're under my protection," he replied, his voice strained. "Because you're vulnerable, and I promised the marshal I'd keep you safe, not take advantage." Clara drew back slightly to look into his troubled eyes. "Matthew Holden, do you truly believe I would allow anyone, even you, to take advantage of me?" A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "No, I suppose not." "Good," she said firmly. "Because while I appreciate your protection, I make my own choices. And right now, I choose you." She pulled him down for another kiss, this one slower, deeper, a promise rather than a discovery. When they parted again, Matthew was looking at her with something approaching wonder. "Clara Bennett," he said quietly, "you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." A distant sound, a horse's whinny, unusual for this hour, brought them both back to reality. Matthew's expression immediately sharpened, his body tensing as he moved to the window. "What is it?" Clara asked, instantly alert. "Not sure," he replied, scanning the darkness. "But something's not right." The sound of running footsteps in the hallway preceded Rufus's appearance at the study door, his expression grim. "Riders approaching from the north," he reported. "At least a dozen, moving fast." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Blackwood's men. They've brought reinforcements." He turned to Clara. "Go upstairs with Mrs. Abernathy. Stay away from the windows." "Matthew," she began to protest. "Please, Clara," he cut her off, his eyes pleading. "I need to know you're safe while we deal with this." Reluctantly, she nodded, following Rufus into the hallway where Mrs. Abernathy was already waiting, a shotgun in her hands. The housekeeper led Clara upstairs while Matthew issued rapid instructions to his men. From an upstairs window overlooking the rear of the house, Clara could see ranch hands taking up defensive positions. Matthew emerged onto the front porch just as a large group of riders pulled up in the yard, their torches illuminating the night. Despite Matthew's warning, Clara cracked the window slightly to hear what was being said. "Holden," called a voice she didn't recognize. "Send out the Bennett woman, and we'll leave your ranch standing." "You're trespassing on private property," Matthew's voice carried clearly in the night air. "Turn around and leave before this gets ugly." A different voice, this one she recognized as Turner's, responded. "We're not leaving without the woman who murdered Harold Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood here wants justice for his son." Clara's blood ran cold. Harold Blackwood's father was among the riders. The most powerful man in Helena had come personally to see her punished. "The marshal has already spoken with Miss Bennett," Matthew replied evenly. "This matter will be settled in court, not by vigilante justice." "Courts can be slow," came a new voice, older, authoritative. "Gerald Blackwood," she presumed. "A father's grief doesn't wait on legal niceties." "The woman killed my son. An eye for an eye, Mr. Holden." "Your son attacked an innocent woman," Matthew countered. She defended herself, as was her right. "If you want to discuss eyes and what they're worth, perhaps we should talk about what your son tried to take from Miss Bennett first." A murmur went through the gathered men. Clara could sense the uncertainty, the division among them. Not all were as committed to Blackwood's cause as Turner. "I won't ask again," Blackwood Sr. stated coldly. "Deliver the woman, or we'll take her by force." "You're welcome to try," Matthew replied, his voice equally cold. "But I should warn you, my men are positioned throughout the property. The first rider who attempts to approach this house will be shot." As if to emphasize his point, several of the Double Creek hands emerged from the shadows, all armed and ready. Clara counted at least 10, nearly matching Blackwood's force. A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice called out from the darkness beyond the yard. "That would be inadvisable, Mr. Blackwood." Marshal Hayes rode into the circle of torchlight, accompanied by 4 deputies. The lawman's expression was grim as he surveyed the scene. "Marshal," Blackwood acknowledged stiffly, "this is a private matter." Threatening a woman with a dozen armed men looks more like attempted murder than a private matter, Hayes replied evenly. I received word of your little expedition from a concerned citizen in Pine Ridge. Seems your men weren't particularly discreet about your plans. Clara suspected the concerned citizen had likely been Pastor Miller or one of the churchgoers who'd witnessed the confrontation at the social. My son was murdered, Blackwood stated, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. I'm seeking justice. Justice comes from the courts, not from midnight raids, Hayes countered. The circuit judge will be in Helena in 3 weeks' time. Miss Bennett will stand trial then, and all evidence, including testimony about your son's character and behavior, will be heard. Hayes moved his horse closer to Blackwood. Now, I suggest you and your men return to Helena before I arrest the lot of you for attempted kidnapping and threatening bodily harm. For a long, tense moment, Clara thought Blackwood might defy the marshal. But the presence of official law enforcement had changed the equation significantly. With a curt nod, Blackwood reined his horse around. This isn't over, Holden, he called out. The Blackwood name still means something in this territory. So does the law, Matthew replied steadily. Remember that when the trial comes. Clara watched as the riders departed, Marshal Hayes and his deputies ensuring they left Double Creek property entirely. Only when they were gone did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Mrs. Abernathy touched her shoulder gently. Come away from the window now, child. It's over for tonight. But Clara knew it wasn't truly over. It wouldn't be over until she faced the judge and jury, until she discovered whether the territory of Montana believed a schoolteacher had the right to defend herself against a powerful man's son. When she went downstairs, she found Matthew and the marshal in conversation. Both men looked up as she entered, their expressions grave. Miss Bennett, Hayes greeted her with a nod. I apologize for the unpleasantness tonight. Rest assured, Gerald Blackwood will receive a stern warning about interfering with the judicial process. Thank you, Marshal, Clara replied, for coming when you did. Hayes's expression softened slightly. Pastor Miller sent a rider to my office the moment Turner and his men left the social. Said he had a bad feeling about their intentions. He glanced at Matthew. Seems you've made some friends in Pine Ridge, despite your reclusive tendencies, Holden. Matthew's mouth quirked. Surprising as that may be. I'll leave a deputy here for the next few days, Hayes continued, just as a precaution, and I'll expect you both in Helena on the 15th of next month for the trial. After the marshal departed, Clara found herself alone with Matthew for the first time since their interrupted moment in the study. The memory of his kiss brought warmth to her cheeks, but the events that followed had cast a shadow over everything. You should get some rest, Matthew said gently. It's been a long night. Clara nodded, exhaustion suddenly weighing on her like a physical burden. Will you be all right? Matthew's expression softened. I'm not the one facing a trial, Clara. No, she agreed. But you've put yourself and your ranch at risk for me. That's not a small thing. He moved closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. Some things are worth the risk. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet certainty, nearly undid her composure. Clara leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering support. We should talk, she said softly, about what happened before Rufus interrupted us. Matthew's thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. Yes, we should, but not tonight. Tonight, you need sleep more than conversation. Clara knew he was right, but still she hesitated. Promise me something? Anything, he replied without hesitation. Promise me that whatever happens at the trial, you won't regret helping me. Matthew's eyes held hers, steady and certain. That's one promise I can make without reservation, Clara Bennett. He bent to brush his lips against her forehead, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Sleep well, he murmured. I'll be here when you wake. As Clara climbed the stairs to her room, exhaustion battling with the lingering warmth of Matthew's touch, she realized something had fundamentally changed. Whatever happened in Helena, whatever the jury decided, she was no longer alone. And that knowledge gave her the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The following weeks passed in a strange mixture of tension and domesticity. Marshal Hayes's deputy remained at Double Creek, a visible reminder of both protection and the approaching trial. Clara continued her work with the accounts and household tasks, finding comfort in the routine even as anxiety about her future grew. Matthew was a constant, steadying presence. Though they hadn't spoken directly about the kiss they'd shared, something had shifted in their relationship. His gaze lingered on her more frequently, his hand often finding the small of her back when they walked together. Casual touches that seemed both deliberate and natural. One evening, a week before they were due to travel to Helena, Clara found Matthew on the porch, staring out at the sunset. She joined him silently, leaning against the railing beside him. "Penny for your thoughts," she said after a comfortable silence. Matthew glanced at her, the fading sunlight casting his features in gold. "Thinking about the ranch. The cattle will need moving to the north pasture soon. Rufus can handle it while we're in Helena, but you worry," Clara finished for him. "It's your home, your responsibility. Of course you worry." Matthew's expression softened. "It's more than that. I was thinking about how much has changed since you arrived. How Double Creek feels like a home again, not just a ranch to be managed." Clara's heart quickened at his words. "Is that a good change, in your estimation?" "The best," he replied simply. After a moment, he added, "I've been thinking about what happens after the trial." Clara tensed slightly. This was the conversation she'd both longed for and dreaded. "And what have you concluded?" Matthew turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. "That depends on you, Clara. If you're acquitted when you're acquitted," he corrected himself firmly, "you'll be free to go wherever you choose. Back to teaching, perhaps, or even back east to your family." "And if that's not what I want?" she asked softly. Matthew took a step closer, his hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Then I hope you might consider making your arrangement with Double Creek more permanent." Clara's breath caught. "Are you offering me continued employment, Mr. Holden?" A smile, a real, full smile that transformed his usually solemn face, broke across Matthew's features. "No, Miss Bennett. I'm rather awkwardly attempting to tell you that I've fallen in love with you, and I hope you might consider becoming more than my bookkeeper." Joy bubbled up within Clara, bright and unexpected. "Matthew Holden, was that a proposal?" He laughed softly, the sound so rare and wonderful it made her heart ache. "A preliminary exploration of your feelings on the matter. The proper proposal will come after the trial, assuming you're amenable." Clara moved into the circle of his arms, her own coming up to rest against his chest. "I am very amenable, Mr. Holden. In fact, I would go so far as to say I am enthusiastically in favor of such a proposal." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "You've brought life back to this place, Clara. Back to me. Whatever happens in Helena, I want you to know that. I love you," she whispered, the words she'd been holding back for weeks finally finding voice. "I never expected to find you to find this when I ran from Helena." Matthew's kiss was tender, a promise sealed between them as the last light of day faded from the sky. When they finally parted, Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We should go inside," Matthew murmured eventually. "Mrs. Abernathy will be sending out a search party soon." Clara laughed softly. "She'll be insufferably pleased with herself. I think she's been planning our wedding since the day I arrived." "Probably before that," Matthew agreed with a chuckle. "She's been trying to find me a wife for years." As they walked back into the house, hand in hand, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since the night Harold Blackwood forced his way into her rooms. Whatever the trial brought, she had found something precious at Double Creek, a home, a future, and a love she hadn't dared hope for. The journey to Helena 3 days later was undertaken with mixed emotions. Clara felt sick with anxiety about the trial, yet simultaneously buoyed by Matthew's steady presence beside her and the private understanding between them. They traveled with Rufus and 2 other ranch hands as protection, though Turner and his men had made no further appearances since the night the marshal intervened. Helena had changed little in the weeks since Clara's hasty departure, yet it felt alien to her now. The streets where she had once walked confidently as the town schoolteacher now seemed filled with potential hostility. She kept her head down as their wagon made its way to the hotel where they would stay during the trial. Marshal Hayes met them at the hotel, his expression serious but not unkind. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Holden. Everything's arranged for tomorrow. The judge arrived yesterday, and we'll hear your case first thing in the morning." "What can we expect?" Matthew asked, his hand protectively at Clara's elbow. Hayes sighed. "The Blackwoods have hired Harlan Webb as prosecutor. He's sharp, ruthless. But Judge Harmon is fair, and I've secured Abigail Cooper's testimony, along with several other character witnesses who've agreed to speak about Blackwood's previous behavior. And the Blackwood family? Clara asked, dreading the answer. Gerald Blackwood will be there, Hayes confirmed grimly. He's been relatively quiet since our encounter at your ranch, but make no mistake, he wants a conviction. After the marshal left, Clara paced their small sitting room, unable to settle. Matthew watched her for a while before gently catching her hand as she passed. Clara, he said softly, drawing her down beside him on the sofa. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together. She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I'm afraid, Matthew, not just of the verdict, but of facing them all, the Blackwoods, the townspeople who'll be watching. Having to relive that night in front of everyone. Matthew's arm tightened around her shoulders. You're the strongest person I know, Clara Bennett. You survived that night. You can survive telling the truth about it. Clara closed her eyes, hoping his faith in her wasn't misplaced. The courthouse was packed the following morning. It seemed all of Helena had turned out to witness the trial of the schoolteacher who had killed Harold Blackwood. Clara felt their stares as Matthew escorted her to the defendant's table, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. Gerald Blackwood sat in the front row of spectators, his face a mask of cold hatred. Beside him was a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to Harold, a brother, Clara presumed. She looked away quickly, focusing instead on Mrs. Cooper, who offered a small, encouraging smile from across the room. Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with a neatly trimmed white beard, called the court to order. The proceedings began with the prosecutor, Harlan Webb, presenting the case against Clara, painting her as a calculating woman who had led Harold Blackwood on, then murdered him in cold blood when he attempted to end their relationship. Clara listened in sick horror as Webb twisted the events of that night into something unrecognizable. According to his version, she had invited Harold to her rooms, then shot him during an argument over money he allegedly paid her for services rendered. When it was her turn to testify, Clara rose on shaky legs. Matthew squeezed her hand once before releasing her, his eyes full of encouragement. Taking the oath, Clara faced the courtroom, determined to speak the truth clearly and without shame. Miss Bennett, her lawyer, a capable man named James Foster whom Matthew had engaged, began. Please tell the court, in your own words, what occurred on the night of May 12th. Clara took a deep breath. I had attended the school social that evening. As the schoolteacher, it was my duty to oversee the children's performances and speak with parents. Harold Blackwood was there, as he had been at every social function since my arrival in Helena 6 months prior. She kept her voice steady as she continued. Mr. Blackwood had expressed interest in me from the beginning, despite my clear indications that I did not return his feelings. That night, he followed me home. I was alone in my rooms above the mercantile when he knocked on my door. Clara described, without flinching, how Blackwood had forced his way inside, how his initial pretense at civility had quickly given way to rage when she once again rejected him, how he had torn her dress and struck her when she fought back. I managed to reach the drawer where I kept a small pistol, a gift from my father when I moved west. Mr. Blackwood laughed when he saw it, said no one would believe a nobody schoolteacher over the Blackwood name. Clara's voice finally faltered. When he came at me again, I fired. I had no choice. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Clara's character, suggesting she had engaged in inappropriate relationships with other men in town. He produced a letter Harold had written to a friend, describing Clara in intimate terms that made her face burn with humiliation. Is it not true, Miss Bennett, Webb pressed, that you and Mr. Blackwood had an understanding? That you welcomed his attention until you realized he had no intention of marrying a woman of your status? No, Clara replied firmly. Mr. Blackwood invented whatever understanding he described to others. I never encouraged his attentions. I never invited him to my rooms. And I certainly never expected or wanted marriage to him. The questioning continued for what felt like hours, Webb attempting to trap her in inconsistencies, to paint her as calculating and manipulative. Through it all, Clara held firm to the truth, though tears of frustration and exhaustion threatened several times. When she was finally allowed to step down, Clara felt drained but strangely calm. She had spoken her truth. Whatever the outcome, She had faced her accuser and held her ground. Mrs. Cooper testified next, describing how she had heard the struggle from her rooms below Clara's, how she had recognized Blackwood's voice making explicit threats. A young man who worked at the livery stable testified that he had seen Blackwood following Clara home that night, describing his manner as determined, angry-like. Most surprisingly, a young woman named Eliza Patterson took the stand and described, with visible discomfort, how Blackwood had cornered her at a social the previous year, making similar unwanted advances and threatening her reputation when she refused him. Throughout the testimony, Matthew sat beside Clara, his steady presence a source of strength. Occasionally, his hand would find hers under the table, a brief, reassuring touch that helped her maintain her composure. As the trial entered its second day, Webb called Gerald Blackwood to the stand. The grieving father presented a picture of a devoted, honorable son whose only fault had been falling in love with a woman beneath his station. His testimony was clearly designed to evoke sympathy from the jury, and Clara could see it was effective with some. In his closing argument, Webb painted Clara as a cold-blooded killer who had lured Harold Blackwood to his death, a fortune-hunting schoolteacher who had taken a man's life when her schemes failed. Foster, in contrast, spoke quietly but passionately about a woman's right to defend herself, about the evidence supporting Clara's account, and about the character of a man who would force himself on an unwilling woman. Harold Blackwood may have been a prominent citizen, Foster concluded, but that prominence did not give him the right to take what was not freely given. Clara Bennett acted as any person would when faced with violence. She protected herself. That is not murder. That is the most basic human right of self-preservation. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Clara sat rigidly in her chair, unable to move. Matthew's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her against him regardless of the watching courtroom. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember you have a home waiting. You have people who believe you." The jury's deliberations lasted less than 2 hours, a surprisingly short time that Clara wasn't sure how to interpret. As they filed back into the courtroom, she searched their faces for some indication of their decision, but they avoided her gaze. Judge Harmon called for the verdict, and the foreman stood, paper in hand. The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Clara Bennett, not guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a buzz of conversation. Clara sat frozen, unable to comprehend the words she'd just heard. On the charge of manslaughter, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant not guilty." Relief crashed over Clara in a dizzying wave. She swayed slightly, and Matthew's arm tightened around her. "The defendant is hereby acquitted of all charges and free to go," Judge Harmon announced, bringing down his gavel with finality. Gerald Blackwood's face contorted with rage. He rose from his seat, pointing at Clara. "This is a travesty of justice. That woman murdered my son." "Mr. Blackwood," the judge warned, "control yourself or I'll have you removed from my courtroom." As the Blackwoods stormed out, Clara turned to Matthew, tears of relief streaming down her face. Without hesitation, he gathered her in his arms, holding her tightly as the courtroom continued to buzz around them. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "It's finally over." Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Cooper and several other townspeople approached to offer their congratulations and support. Clara was overwhelmed by their kindness, having expected ostracism even if acquitted. "Will you be returning to teaching, Miss Bennett?" Mrs. Cooper asked. Before Clara could respond, Matthew stepped forward, taking her hand in his. "Actually, Mrs. Cooper, Miss Bennett has agreed to become Mrs. Holden, if she still finds the prospect appealing after this ordeal." Clara looked up at him in surprise, her heart swelling with love for this steadfast man. "I find it more appealing than ever, Mr. Holden." Mrs. Cooper beamed at them. "Well, that's the best news I've heard all day, though the children will miss you terribly as their teacher." "Perhaps," Clara suggested, the idea forming as she spoke, "I might start a small school at Double Creek, for the children of the ranch hands and nearby farms." Matthew's expression brightened. "That's an excellent idea. The old cabin by the creek could be converted easily enough." As they made plans and accepted congratulations, Marshal Hayes approached, his expression both pleased and cautious. "Congratulations, Miss Bennett," he said sincerely. "Justice was served today." "Thank you, Marshal," Clara replied, "for everything you did to ensure that justice." Hayes nodded, then lowered his voice. "I should warn you both, Gerald Blackwood isn't a man who accepts defeat gracefully." He made some rather explicit threats as he left the courthouse. "I'd advise caution for a while." Matthew's jaw tightened. "We'll be vigilant, Marshal, but we won't live in fear." "Good," Hayes approved. "And I hear congratulations are in order for you both?" Clara smiled, leaning against Matthew's side. "Yes, we're to be married." "Well then," Hayes said with a smile, "I look forward to attending the wedding." Double Creek could use some celebration after all this. As they prepared to leave Helena the following morning, Clara made one last visit to her former rooms above the mercantile to collect the few possessions she'd left behind in her hasty flight. Mrs. Cooper accompanied her, chattering happily about the wedding and Clara's plans for a school at Double Creek. Standing in the small room where her life had changed so dramatically, Clara felt a strange sense of closure. The fear and trauma of that night would always be with her, but they no longer defined her future. "You know," Mrs. Cooper said thoughtfully as Clara packed the last of her books, "when you first came to Helena, so proper and Eastern, I wondered how long you'd last out here. But you've got real backbone, Clara Bennett. Matthew Holden's a lucky man." Clara smiled, touched by the older woman's approval. "I'm the lucky one, Mrs. Cooper. I found a home when I needed it most." When they returned to the hotel, Matthew was waiting with the wagon packed and ready. "Everything all right?" he asked, studying her face. "Yes," Clara said, and meant it. "I'm ready to go home." The journey back to Double Creek was lighthearted compared to their tense trip to Helena. Clara felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She could look to the future, now a future with Matthew, with the ranch, with the possibility of family and purpose. As they crested the final hill and Double Creek came into view, Matthew reined the horses to a stop. The ranch spread out below them, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, the sturdy main house, the barn and outbuildings, the grazing cattle in the distance. "Welcome home, Clara," Matthew said softly. Clara turned to him, her heart full. "You know, when you found me by your fence post and said you'd give me a home if I gave you a reason to smile, I thought you were mad. Or playing some cruel joke." Matthew's lips curved into that rare, transformative smile she'd come to treasure. "And now I think it was the kindest, most honest offer anyone has ever made me," she replied. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life giving you reasons to smile, Matthew Holden." His kiss was gentle but full of promise. When they parted, he flicked the reins, and the horses started down the hill toward home. "I have something for you," Matthew said as they approached the ranch house. "A wedding gift of sorts." Clara looked at him curiously. "Isn't it traditional to wait until after the wedding for such things?" Matthew shrugged, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "I've never been overly concerned with tradition." As they pulled up to the house, Clara noticed something different, a new sign hanging beside the main entrance. "Double Creek Ranch," it read, and beneath in smaller letters, "Matthew and Clara Holden, proprietors." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes as she read it. "Matthew, this place was never truly mine until you came," he said quietly. "It was my father's legacy, my burden to maintain. You made it a home again, Clara. It seems only right that it should bear your name as well as mine." Clara leaned across the wagon seat to kiss him, not caring who might be watching. "I love you, Matthew Holden. And I love you, Clara Bennett, soon to be Holden," he replied, his smile as bright and warm as the summer sun. Mrs. Abernathy appeared on the porch, hands on her hips in her usual stern pose, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Well, are you two planning to sit in that wagon all evening, or shall I start preparing a proper homecoming dinner?" Matthew laughed, a free, joyous sound that Clara had heard too rarely. "We're coming, Mrs. Abernathy. And you'd better start planning a wedding feast while you're at it." The housekeeper's stern facade cracked into a wide smile. "About time, I'd say. Now come inside, both of you. This house has been far too quiet without you." As Matthew helped her down from the wagon, Clara took a moment to look around at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, her home, her future. From desperate flight to newfound happiness, it was a journey she could never have imagined on that terrible night in Helena. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. Clara smiled up at him, taking his hand in hers. I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us exactly where we need to be. Matthew's free hand came up to cup her cheek. Well, in that case, I'm selfishly grateful that your path led you to my fence post, Clara Bennett. As am I, Matthew Holden, she replied. As am I. Hand in hand, they walked into their house where warmth, acceptance, and love awaited. The journey had been difficult, but the destination was everything Clara could have hoped for and more. She had found not just a house, but a true home, not just safety, but belonging, not just a protector, but a partner who saw her strength as clearly as her vulnerability. And Matthew Holden, the solemn rancher who had offered shelter to a desperate stranger, had found his reason to smile again. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect autumn day with the mountains blazing with golden aspen trees. The entire community of Pine Ridge turned out for the occasion, along with friends from Helena, including Mrs. Cooper and Marshall Hayes. The ceremony was held on the Double Creek Ranch, with Pastor Miller officiating beneath an arch of wildflowers erected near the creek that gave the ranch its name. Clara wore a simple gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Abernathy and several local women had worked on together, with a crown of late-blooming flowers in her dark hair. Matthew, standing tall and proud in a new suit, watched her approach with an expression of such naked adoration that tears sprang to Clara's eyes. As they exchanged vows, pledging to love and cherish one another through whatever challenges life might bring, Clara thought of the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first desperate meeting at the fence post to the courthouse in Helena, from fear to safety, from loneliness to love, every step had led them here, to this perfect day. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Miller declared, beaming at the couple. Matthew, you may kiss your bride. Matthew needed no further encouragement. His kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause as they finally broke apart, both flushed and smiling. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing, feasting, and much laughter. Clara, moving among their guests with Matthew's hand warm in hers, felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. These people, once strangers, had become her community, her extended family. As twilight settled over the ranch, Matthew drew her away from the festivities toward the creek, where the water flowed clear and cool between grassy banks. Happy, Mrs. Holden? He asked, his arms encircling her waist. Perfectly, she replied, leaning back against his chest. Though I will admit to looking forward to when our guests depart and we have the house to ourselves. Matthew's low chuckle vibrated against her back, a sentiment I heartily share. He pressed a kiss to her temple, then added more seriously, I have something for you, a wedding gift. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. Clara opened it curiously to find a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, one of Matthew, and one of a distinguished older gentleman with Matthew's eyes and jawline. Your father, Clara guessed, touching the small image gently. Matthew nodded. It was my mother's. I hoped you might like to wear it, to keep both of us close to your heart. Tears welled in Clara's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. It's beautiful, Matthew. I'll treasure it always. She turned in his arms to face him. But you know I don't need a locket to keep you in my heart. You're there already, permanently. His kiss was slow and sweet, a perfect culmination of the day's joy. When they finally returned to their guests, Clara wore the locket around her neck, its weight a comfortable reminder of the past they honored and the future they would build together. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, and they were finally alone in the master bedroom that was now theirs to share, Matthew took Clara in his arms with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. I love you, Clara Holden, he whispered against her lips. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, she replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. My protector, my partner, my home. As they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, their strength multiplied by the bond they shared. In the years that followed, Double Creek Ranch prospered under their joint care. The small school Clara established became a valued institution in the region, drawing children from miles around to learn from the teacher who was as kind as she was determined. Matthew's cattle operation expanded, and with Clara's careful management of the accounts, they were able to repurchase the north pastures his father had been forced to sell. True to Marshall Hayes's warning, Gerald Blackwood attempted several times to cause trouble for them, using his influence to try to block their cattle sales or spread malicious rumors. But the community that had embraced Clara and Matthew stood firm against such tactics, and eventually, even Blackwood's considerable power waned in the face of their persistent success and integrity. 2 years after their wedding, Clara gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Matthew's mother. The little girl had her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit, bringing new joy and laughter to Double Creek. On Elizabeth's second birthday, as they watched her toddle after Mrs. Abernathy in the garden, Clara leaned against Matthew's side, content in a way she had never imagined possible that terrible night in Helena. "Happy?" Matthew asked, his arms secure around her shoulders. Clara smiled up at him, at the face that had become as familiar and beloved as her own. The years had added a few more lines around his eyes, but they were smile lines now, testament to the joy that had become a regular part of their lives. "Completely," she replied truthfully. "Are you?" Matthew's answering smile was bright and unreserved, a far cry from the reluctant half-smiles of their early acquaintance. "More than I deserve to be." Clara shook her head at this familiar refrain. "You deserve every happiness, Matthew Holden, and I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring you receive it." As their daughter ran to them, arms outstretched and face alight with the pure joy of childhood, Matthew swept her up in his strong arms, his laughter joining hers in perfect harmony. "I think," he said, looking from his daughter to his wife with undisguised love, "that I have all the happiness any man could ask for right here." And Clara, watching her husband and daughter together, knew that the promise made beside a fence post all those years ago had been fulfilled beyond measure. He had given her a home when she needed it most, and in return, she had given him countless reasons to smile. It was, she reflected as she joined her family's embrace, the most perfectly balanced exchange imaginable, a trade of shelter for joy, of protection for love, of two broken paths merging to create one beautiful journey forward. Together, they had transformed Double Creek from a ranch to a home, from a business to a legacy. And that, Clara thought as Matthew's arm drew her close, was the true meaning of happily ever after.